Pyrrhonism is an ancient Greek philosophy founded by Pyrrho of Elis in the 4th century BCE. Pyrrho taught that emotional disturbances are caused by false beliefs, and so he emphasized the importance of suspending judgment about non-evident matters. Pyrrho travelled with Alexander the Great's army to India, where he mixed with Zoroastrian magi and Indian ascetics. It is likely that he was influenced by Buddhist thought during this time, as there are significant similarities between Buddhist and Pyrrhonist ideas. However, much of these similarities are found in the work of the Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna, who lived some 600 years after Pyrrho. It is therefore speculated that early Pyrrhonism was influenced by early Buddhism, but in return, the later Pyrrhonian texts influenced the later Buddhism. One of those texts, named Outlines of Pyrrhonism, was written by Sextus Empiricus in the 2nd century CE. In it, Sextus provides a systematic account of the entire Pyrrhonian philosophy as it had developed over the prior 600 years. Of particular importance is the concept of epoché, which we shall explore throughout this summary. Enjoy. Book 1, Sections 1 to 13, on the Skeptic Way. Skepticism is a philosophy that questions our ability to find truth, while nevertheless continuing to search for it. The Skeptic Way, also known as the zetetic, effectic, aporetic or Pyrrhonian way, is a disposition to question phenomena and noumena, which leads to a state of suspension of judgment called epoché, and a state of tranquility called ataraxia. The Skeptic Way begins with the goal of attaining ataraxia, and originates from those who are troubled by inconsistencies in facts. The main origin of skepticism is the practice of considering opposing statements as equal in credibility, resulting in an end to dogmatic thinking. Skeptics do not dogmatize or make firm assertions about non-evident matters, but instead present skeptical slogans such as "nothing more" or "I determine nothing" without belief. Skeptics do not have a traditional system of dogmatic beliefs, but do have a way of life that aims to produce the disposition of suspending judgment. They do not make firm assertions about nature or any other parts of philosophy. Though they may touch upon philosophy in the process of questioning everything, they do not deny appearances, but question statements about them. They live in accordance with the ordinary regimen of life without beliefs, following the guidance of nature, the compulsion of emotions, laws and customs, and instruction in arts and crafts. Again, the goal of the Skeptic Way is ataraxia, which is a state of being free from disturbance, and being calm and untroubled. This is achieved by suspending judgment, which is when the skeptic is unable to resolve a controversy between positions of equal strength. The skeptic is able to achieve ataraxia by not taking a position on what is by nature good or bad, for this leads to not avoiding or pursuing things intensely. The skeptic is only troubled by things that are unavoidable, such as being cold or hungry, but is able to handle these things with moderation by eliminating the belief that these things are naturally bad. Sections 14 to 27 on the Modes of Epoché. The older skeptics formulated 10 modes or arguments in order to achieve epoché, the suspension of judgment. The first mode is that external objects are perceived differently by different animals due to variations in their physical structures and ways of reproduction. The second mode is that even among human beings, there are variations in physical characteristics and intelligence, which lead to different perceptions and choices. The third mode is based on the differences in the constitution of the sense organs. The skeptics argue that because the senses do not apprehend external objects accurately, the intellect is not capable of doing so either. The fourth mode argues that the intellect is not capable of apprehending external objects accurately because they appear differently to us depending on circumstances, conditions, and predispositions. The fifth mode is that the same object can appear differently depending on its position, distance, and location, leading to different perceptions, making it impossible to determine the true nature of the object. The sixth mode argues that since external objects are always affected by factors such as the air, humidity, and lighting, it is impossible to know their true nature. The seventh mode argues that the same object can appear different depending on its quantity, or the combinations of its parts. The eighth mode argues that everything is relative, and it is impossible to understand the true nature of an object without considering its relation to other things. The ninth mode argues that the same objects can appear different depending on how often they occur. The 10th mode argues that customs, laws, beliefs, and dogmatic assumptions vary widely between cultures and change over time, making it difficult to make absolute statements. The later skeptics formulated 5 modes of epoché. The mode based on disagreement is demonstrated by the differences of opinions among philosophers and people in general, which reveals our uncertainty. The mode based on infinite regress argues that all proof rests on matters themselves in need of proof, and so on to infinity. The mode based on relativity argues that all things are changed as their relations become changed, or as we look upon them from different points of view. The mode based on hypothesis argues that the asserted truth is based on unsupported assumptions, and the mode based on circularity argues that the asserted truth involves a circularity of proofs. These modes all lead to suspension of judgment on a topic due to an inability to reach a verdict. Furthermore, the skeptics have 2 additional modes of epoché. First, things cannot be apprehended through themselves since there are disputes between scientists concerning sense objects and thought objects. And second, things cannot be apprehended through something else because then we would encounter the circularity or infinite regress modes of epoché. This leads to the conclusion that there is no apparent criterion of truth or of apprehension. The skeptics use the mode of non-assertion as a way to suspend judgment on uncertain matters and avoid making any affirmations or denials about things that are not evident. They use slogans such as "not more" or "nothing more" to express their belief that things are equally persuasive and there is no way to determine the truth. Additionally, the skeptics use various other modes such as the mode based on disagreement, infinite regress, relativity, hypothesis, and circularity to produce aporia, which is a state of puzzlement, and challenge the claims of dogmatists. They also use the mode of non-assertion to acknowledge that there are things that they are forced to assent to due to the emotions they evoke, but they do not make dogmatic statements about them. Skeptics use slogans such as perhaps, possibly, and maybe to express non-assertion and leave room for doubt and uncertainty. They use the phrase "I withhold assent" to indicate they are unable to decide which of the proposed alternatives is credible. They use "I determine nothing" to indicate that they don't put forward an assent to any non-evident thing. They use indeterminateness to indicate a state of mind where they do not take a negative or affirmative position on non-evident matters, and non-apprehensible to indicate that all non-evident matters are non-apprehensible to them. They use "to every argument an equal argument is opposed" to express that for every dogmatic argument there appears to be another opposing argument that is equal in terms of credibility. This is to ensure the skeptic does not miss out on the state of ataraxia that comes from suspending judgment on everything. Sections 28 to 34 on the philosophers. The Heraclitean, Democritean, Cyrenaic, and Protagorean philosophies are different from the Skeptic Way because they make dogmatic assertions about non-evident things, whereas the skeptic does not. Skepticism does not promote acceptance of these philosophies, and in fact works against them by rejecting their dogmatic assertions. The Skeptic Way posits ataraxia as the ultimate goal, which is incompatible with the ultimate goals of these philosophies. Skeptics suspend judgment on the nature of external objects, while these philosophies assert that these objects have a nature that is apprehensible. The academic philosophy has 3 different branches: the Old Academy of Plato, the Middle Academy of Arcesilaus, and the New Academy of Carneades and Clytomachus. The New Academy believed that some knowledge could be attained through reason and observation, but that certainty was impossible to attain. They distinguished mental perceptions, or fantasia, that were simply plausible, from fantasia that were both plausible and tested. They believed that plausible and tested fantasia were preferable to the simply plausible ones. The goal of the New Academy was to use the plausible in everyday life, while the goal of the skeptics was to live without belief, following the laws, customs, and natural pathe, or drives. Arcesilaus, the head of the Middle Academy, is said to have shared the Pyrrhonian arguments, and to have suspended judgment about everything. The goal of the Middle Academy was therefore the suspension of judgment, which was accompanied by ataraxia. However, the Skeptic Way differs from the Middle Academic in that they do not make any dogmatic assertions, and they only follow the common course of life in order to be capable of action. Finally, empiricism in the medical system is not the same as skepticism. However, skeptics should adopt the so-called method of the medical system, as it does not make quick assumptions about unknown things. The method follows appearances and uses what seems beneficial, similar to skeptic practice. Both skeptics and methodic physicians use words in a relaxed and undogmatic way. The methodic physician's way, therefore, has a connection with skepticism, more so than other medical systems. Book 2, Sections 1 to 7, on the Criterion for Truth. The concept of a criterion for determining truth is problematic, for it falls into circular reasoning. For example, a criterion is necessary to decide disputes about truth, but in order to agree on a criterion, there would need to be an already agreed-upon criterion. This leads to a circular argument and shows the rashness of those who argue for the existence of a criterion. Additionally, proof requires a criterion that has been proven, but the criterion itself needs proof. This again leads to a circular argument, highlighting the difficulties in agreeing on a criterion for determining truth. The three components of the criterion, which are the agent, the means, and the standard, are not intelligible. The dogmatists, who believe they have accurate knowledge, are precluded from inquiry because they think they already know the truth. The skeptics suspend judgment on the matter of the existence of a criterion for determining truth. They believe that it is not possible to arrive at certainty about the nature of reality, and that the pursuit of knowledge should focus on inquiry and the suspension of judgment, rather than dogmatic adherence to beliefs. Using the concept of a human being as a criterion for making determinations has limitations. The dogmatists, such as Democritus and Epicurus, provide contradictory and nonsensical definitions of what a human being is, making it impossible to frame and apprehend the concept. Philosophers also argue about the existence and nature of the soul, and lack a way to decide this dispute. Additionally, it cannot be proven that human beings should be the ones to make determinations. The question of who is the most sagacious person to make determinations is subjective, and there is still the possibility of error even from the most sagacious person. As such, it does not make sense to rely on determinations made by a single human being. There are also limitations to using the senses and intellect to determine the truth about external objects and states of affairs. The senses can contradict themselves, and the intellect is in dispute with itself concerning its own existence. Therefore, it is not possible to make determinations about external objects and states of affairs by means of senses and intellect without an agreed-upon criterion. Phantasia, or sense impressions, are not a valid criterion, for it is impossible to conceive of an impression, and even if it were, it would not be apprehended. Additionally, even if the impression were apprehended, it would not be possible to make determinations about external objects and states of affairs in accord with it, because the impression is only of a sensory pathos, and is not the external object itself. Sections 8 to 17. On Logic. The dogmatists argue that truth and the true are different in three ways, in essence, in composition, and in power. They argue that the true is a simple proposition, while truth is composed of all the true items of knowledge. That is, truth, but not the true, involves knowledge and only exists in the wise. However, if we can destroy the general foundation of the true, then we also destroy the specific arguments of the dogmatists. We can achieve this by arguing that it is impossible to know if something is true due to the circularity of trying to prove the truth of a statement. Alternatives for the nature of truth, such as true statements concerning only appearances, are not viable, as they lead to an infinite regress of trying to determine what is true. The conclusion is that it is impossible to determine the truth of any statement. The Stoics' concept of a sign as a true antecedent in a sound conditional or implication is not conceivable, as it is non-evident whether there is such a thing as a logical statement, which they called a lecton. Nevertheless, even if lector exist, propositions do not exist. Furthermore, the concept of a sound conditional is also not apprehensible, as different philosophers have different definitions for what constitutes a sound conditional or implication. It is also impossible to conceive of a sign that is both relative to the thing it signifies, and which also serves to disclose that thing. It is impossible to prove that there is such a thing as a sign, and the idea that all signs are appearances is problematic, as this leads to the conclusion that the things signified would also be appearances, making them things that cannot be signified. If the conclusion of an argument is non-evident, then the premises must also be non-evident, making it impossible to infer the conclusion from the premises. On the other hand, if the premises are pre-evident, the conclusion will also be pre-evident, and therefore there is no need to infer the conclusion from the premises. The Stoics' 5 undemonstrated syllogisms are invalid because they rely on circular reasoning. Consider the following. Every human being is an animal. Socrates is a human being, therefore Socrates is an animal, and if it is day, it is light. It is not light, therefore it is not day. These syllogisms are invalid because they rely on previously established propositions, which are used to infer new propositions, leading to circular reasoning. It is also not possible to establish the existence of a generic proof, because a generic proof, which would have some premises and a conclusion, would actually be a particular proof, and the system of premises and conclusion is non-evident because it has a non-evident conclusion. Inductive reasoning, where general principles are inferred from specific observations, has limitations, as it is impossible to consider all relevant observations, which are infinite. If only a portion of observations are considered, the inference may be contradicted by omitted observations, making the inference uncertain. Sections 18 to 22 on natural science. The sciences focus on natural phenomena rather than conventions. Scientific knowledge aims to be stable, whereas conventions are subject to change. The meanings of terms are determined by convention rather than nature, and we have the power to alter conventions and terminology. This raises questions about whether there can be a science of defining meanings, such as in logic. There are discussions about dividing a whole into parts in physics, but it is worth noting some limitations. For example, when a group of 10 things is divided into 1, 2, 3, and 4, the original group no longer exists after the first part is removed. Hence, it is not possible to divide a whole into its parts, as the parts do not exist within the whole before the division. Thus, dividing a whole into parts is impossible, and this also applies to magnitudes. Finally, the dogmatists claim that genera and species are concepts, but this is false. If each species has its own genus, there can be no common genus, and if there is one common genus, each species will only partially partake in it. This means that species will not be similar to one another. Common accidents, like the ability to see or breathe, cannot be the same for two individuals, as each ability is unique to the individual. Book 3. Sections 1 to 10. On causality, matter and motion. The dogmatists assert that God is a maximally productive cause, but disagree about God's substance, form, and location. Yet a concept of God cannot be formed without these agreed-upon characteristics, and so it is doubtful that the existence of God can be proved. The dogmatists also have conflicting views on causality, since it is plausible to believe in causes, and it is also plausible to believe that nothing is the cause of anything. The very concept of causality is circular and unprovable regardless of whether the cause exists at the same time as, before, or after the effect. The ancient philosophers had different theories about the material substance of the world. Some claimed earth, some claimed water, some air, and some even proposed abstract concepts such as matter devoid of quality, or atoms. With so much disagreement, and since both corporeal and incorporeal things are not apprehensible, any position about the elements will be refutable. It is therefore appropriate to suspend judgment. The common understanding of a body as something capable of action or being acted upon is flawed, because it relies on causes that cannot be apprehended. The definition of a body as something extended in 3 dimensions and which is solid is also flawed, as it relies on lines, surfaces, and boundaries that cannot be shown to exist. Similarly, incorporeal things cannot be apprehended, and so a suspension of judgment is necessary when it comes to the existence of both bodies and incorporeal things. Furthermore, the dogmatist's theory of compounds is flawed because it depends on untenable concepts of contact, touch, blending, and mixture. The dogmatists claim that blended things are composed of substances and qualities, and without a clear understanding of how the process of blending occurs, the entire theory of natural philosophy is unintelligible, making the dogmatists' attempts to explain the physical world futile. Philosophers also disagree about the existence of motion. The dogmatists use examples such as the movement of the sun or ships to argue for the existence of motion, while others such as Parmenides and Melissus use logic to argue that motion is impossible. Also, Diodorus Cronus argues that space is indivisible, so that motion is impossible because it would occur infinitely step by step, or otherwise be at all parts of a location at once. Sections 11 to 18 on change, time and number. Due to the constant flux of substances and the constant replacement of parts, adding something to a substance doesn't increase its size, but rather completely alters it. Similarly, decrease can't occur if the substance doesn't maintain its whole, and without addition or subtraction there can't be decrease or increase in size. Subtraction is impossible because it must be part of what it is being subtracted from, yet it cannot be equal, greater, or lesser than what it's being subtracted from. And addition is impossible because what is added cannot be added to itself, nor to a combination of itself and what existed before, nor to just what existed before, as these options all lead to contradiction with observed results. It is also doubtful that there are such things as wholes and parts, as all parts appear to only exist in relation to each other, and thus are not considered real parts. Natural change is flawed and impossible for several reasons. For instance, the idea of change leads to contradictions, the existence of causes is doubtful, and change is neither sensible nor intelligible. Thus, the concepts of generation and destruction should be eliminated, as the physical theory of the dogmatists is unfactual and unintelligible. Some dogmatists believe that all corporeal things are constantly changing and nothing is at rest, while incorporeal things are said to be unable to be at rest. However, if rest, location, and time cannot be conceived without each other, they must be considered together, and if any of them is found to be non-existent, the others will also be non-existent. Some philosophers argue for the existence of location, while others argue against it. Those for its existence point to the existence of different parts of location, such as right and left, up and down, and before and behind. Those against its existence argue that it is nothing more than its parts, and that we must use circular reasoning to infer its existence. The Stoic view that location is a void that can be occupied by a body is doubtful, as is the peripatetic view that location is the boundary of something enclosed. We must therefore conclude that there is no such thing as a location. Time may be finite or infinite, but both lead to contradictions and absurdities. Time also cannot be indivisible or divisible, cannot be composed of past, present, and future, cannot be subject to generation and destruction, and cannot come into being in itself or another time. The conflicting definitions and beliefs about time make it difficult to understand, and may prove its non-existence. The existence of numbers, specifically the monad or the abstract number 1, is also doubtful. The idea of the monad existing separately from the things it enumerates is problematic, as it leads to absurd conclusions like an infinite infinity of intelligible monads. The idea of a dyad, or the number 2, is also unsustainable, and numbers generally cannot be shown to exist independently from the things they enumerate. Therefore, the monad and numbers cannot be shown to exist. Sections 21 to 30 on Ethics and the Art of Living. The ethics part of philosophy concerns itself with things that are good, bad, and indifferent. In order to explain this subject, we must inquire into the existence of things that are good, bad, and indifferent, and set forth the concept of each. The Stoics believe that the good is virtue and worthwhile actions, and that the good is not separate from what is beneficial, such as there being virtuous people and having friends. However, the Stoics reject the definition of good as that which benefits, or that which leads to happiness. They believe that the concept of good must be learned, and that simply benefiting or being desirable is not enough to define it. The Stoics also use the term indifferent in 3 ways: things that are neither desired nor avoided, things that are desired or avoided equally, and things that contribute neither to vice nor to virtue. The existence of a universal definition of good must also be called into question, for different individuals have differing opinions on what is good, making it impossible to determine what is inherently good by nature. Moreover, the different categorizations of goods proposed by philosophers often contradict each other. The Stoic belief in the existence of certain virtues in the soul is impossible to understand. For example, the ruling part of the soul cannot hold the necessary apprehensions or knowledge for the existence of virtues, and the Stoic belief in indifferent things is incomprehensible because things can be considered good or bad depending on context. The concept of naturally good or bad is also flawed, as there is no universal agreement on what is considered morally good or bad. Nevertheless, the skeptic is able to avoid emotional distress by suspending judgment on what is good or bad. We must now consider the idea of the art of living. The Stoics believe that only wise people possess the art of living, but they lack a clear definition of what constitutes an art of living, making their argument flawed. The practicality of the Stoics' beliefs about the art of living is questionable, as it's not unique to wise people, and it can't be carried out in reality. The Stoics also believe that the art of living can be learned and is not innate. According to the Stoics, if it were innate, all people would be virtuous, but they believe most are not. Hence the art of living is acquired through experience and learning, which is supported by the Stoic belief that an art is a system of apprehensions developed through exercise. However, the art of living is not acquired by teaching or learning, as the Stoics claim. For teaching and learning to exist, there must be a subject taught, a teacher, a learner, and a method of learning. However, there is no such thing as any of these, and so there can be no such thing as teaching the art of living. Furthermore, what is taught must either be true or false, but if it is false, it can't be taught, and if it is true, it cannot be shown to exist. Regardless, if the subject matter is an appearance, then it doesn't need to be taught, and if it's non-evident, then it cannot be apprehended. Hence, nothing is teachable, and the art of living cannot be acquired. The existence of skill is also doubtful, as no one is naturally skilled, and an unskilled person cannot become skilled or learn a skill. Further still, nothing can be taught by appeal to obviousness, as what is obvious is already known by everyone, and nothing can be taught by discourse, as language can only signify something by nature or convention, neither of which is reliable for teaching. Even if this art of living were to exist, it may not actually be beneficial for the person who possesses it. A wise person with self-control may not have any impulses towards the bad and away from the good, and they may have evil impulses that they master with reason, but they would still not have full control when it comes to making bad decisions. Additionally, even if the art of living existed and provided benefits, it would also cause great perturbations for the person who possesses it. Ultimately, the dogmatists' ideas about ethics and the art of living are misguided and pretentious. In conclusion, the skeptic, motivated by a desire to help others, uses different arguments depending on the severity of the individual's dogmatism. They use strong arguments for those who are deeply affected by conceit and precipitancy, and milder arguments for those who have a more superficial understanding of these issues. The skeptic is willing to use both strong and weak arguments in order to achieve their goal of helping others overcome their dogmatism. And that brings us to the end of Outlines of Pyrrhonism. If you found any of this helpful or interesting, please consider subscribing and turning on the bell icon so that you can be notified when we release another video like this. Support us by sharing the channel with a friend or by visiting one of the links in the description below. Thank you for your time. Have a marvelous rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.